I love Seattle. David, thank you for that introduction. I'm really here to celebrate what you've accomplished. You have, at a time when a lot of people are discouraged around the country, frankly, in terms of the economy and their own efficacy, their own power to do anything about the economy, you here in Seattle have done something, and done something very significant, which is a trend setter around the country. I'm reminded how discouraged people are around America. I was coming back from this week from Knoxville, Tennessee. People come up to me in airports very often, because I'm kind of conspicuous looking. And they come up to me, and I don't know who they are, but they come up to me and they start, it's almost as if we've been in the middle of a conversation. And this person came up to me and said, "So what are we going to do?" I said, "I don't know." But it happens often, and it is kind of my own free-floating focus group in terms of the anxiety that's out there. There's a lot of anxiety and a lot of feelings of powerlessness. For one thing, we are in, if you didn't already know it, we're in an economic recovery. I hear some skepticism. Well, the skepticism is deserved because this is the first economic recovery ever in history in terms of measurement where the median wage has actually dropped, adjusted for inflation. The median household income has dropped, adjusted for inflation. Now, this is unusual. You hear reports that the economy is doing well. We're having a lot of growth. Second quarter growth figures were just out. Very good. But if the median is going down, what's good about the growth? Or another way of putting it, many of you know the difference between average and median. Whenever an economist is talking about average wages or average incomes, watch your wallets. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'1". Do you get my drift? You see, the people at the top pull up the average. So what you really want to look at in terms of understanding where the American economy is, in terms of the real success of the economy, is you want to look at the median wage. Not only individuals, but because a lot of households have more than one wage earner, you might want to look at household median income. And that is a problem, and it's getting to be a bigger and bigger problem, because in this recovery, 95% of all of the economic gains have gone to the top 1%. Now, when I say that, a lot of people accuse me of being a class warrior. I am not a class warrior. I'm a class worrier. There's one letter different, but it's very important. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think it's a matter of resenting anybody because they're wealthy. But you have to worry when the median starts going down. One reason the economy overall, yes, second quarter growth is good, first quarter growth was terrible. Overall, growth has been very, very, very slow. The worst, most anemic recovery on record. One reason it's not been very good is because when all of the money is going to the top, the middle class and poor don't have enough purchasing power to keep the economy going, or to even get it out of first gear. This is not a complicated idea. In fact, it very much is the idea behind the importance of raising the minimum wage. There are still some economists around who say if you raise the minimum wage, you're going to kill jobs. Well, the fact of the matter is, almost all the studies, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know because you've already gone through a decision-making process, but almost all the studies have shown, and there have been a lot of studies, that if you raise the minimum wage, you put more money into the pockets of people who are going to spend it. And they're going to spend it mostly in the local area. And if they spend it in a local area, they create jobs. And not only are you going to create more jobs because more people have more money to spend, but you're also going to bring more people into the labor force who might otherwise say, well, I'm not all that interested in working for that old minimum wage, but if the minimum wage is higher, yes, I might be attracted into the labor force. So that means employers have slightly more choice of whom to hire, which reduces turnover costs. We know this around the country. We've seen it around the country. In 1996, I was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Labor, and I was looking at wages, and I said to, and one of the things that it seemed to me very important to do was to raise the minimum wage. It had not been raised in years. We had had 12 years before Bill Clinton got there of Republican presidents. I don't want to make this partisan tonight in any way. Republican presidents have served this country. Teddy Roosevelt was a good Republican president. Abraham Lincoln. But we hadn't had a minimum wage increase in a long time, and I said to Bill Clinton, don't you think it is time? And he said, well, you know, I think it probably is. Why don't you check with Dick Morris? Now, some of you may remember, Bill Clinton had a pollster named Dick Morris. And Dick Morris did very fast polls. I don't know how he did them so fast. I asked him to do a poll with regard to support for the minimum wage increase in 1996, and he came back the next morning. He said, you won't believe this, 90% positive support for increasing the minimum wage. I was amazed. He had only had 8 hours to do the poll. I think Dick Morris polls his family. I think that's what he does. It's sort of a technique. But anyway, that poll and other polls showed that there was a huge amount of support, and Bill Clinton was interested in pursuing it, and we got Republicans interested in doing it. And there were some economists who said, no, you mustn't raise the minimum wage because it's going to kill jobs. And I suspected not because of the very reason I gave to you just now. And in fact, we did raise the minimum wage. And what happened over the following 4 years was the best job growth in the United States in American history. Now, and I was directly responsible. No, I wasn't. But here's the thing. I'm not suggesting to you that we created jobs by raising the minimum wage per se. All I am suggesting is something more modest, and that is that by hiking the minimum wage, we did not kill jobs. And you can see that again and again around the country. If you simply took the minimum wage in 1968 and you adjusted it for inflation, you increased it just in terms of the purchasing power of the minimum wage in 1968, that minimum wage today would be way over $10 an hour. And then if you added in and adjusted it for productivity improvements, because the average American worker is much more productive today than he or she was in 1968, you get way over $15 an hour. And that's just keeping it aligned with purchasing power and productivity. You're not actually doing anything more than that. So it's not all, I don't mean to detract from the radical, far-sighted, prescient Seattle decision to raise the minimum wage. I'm just saying that it's just logical. It's just inherently logical. The most amazing thing to me is why other places in other cities have not done it. Now, it could have something to do with a factor that I find sometimes embarrassing to talk about. Because as we've seen widening inequality, as we've seen more and more money, wealth, income coalesce, concentrate at the very top. I said to you before, I'm not a class warrior at all, but this is something that does worry me. When you have all that money going to the top, that money starts infecting and undermining politics. You see, that's... Part of the problem of inequality is not just that you rob the middle class and the poor of enough purchasing power to keep the economy going, but you also start corroding, corrupting, and undermining the democratic system. Money and power are interchangeable. Even before that shameful Supreme Court decision, which I think is one of not only, it's right down there with Dred Scott and Bush against Gore. And of course, I'm talking about Citizens United against the Federal Election Commission, and then McCutcheon. I thought you couldn't even get worse than Citizens United, then you get McCutcheon. I mean, what has happened is you have a perfect storm. You've got all of that money, income, and wealth at the very top, and then you have the Supreme Court opening the floodgates to allowing all that money, income, and wealth to fundamentally undermine our democracy, making it harder for every state, every locale, certainly harder for the federal government, to do things like raising the minimum wage or do other things that are necessary, that are absolutely critical, expanding the earned income tax credit, for example. Now, your eyes just glazed over. I saw that. Never before has there been so important a public policy that fewer people knew about than the earned income tax credit. It's a wage supplement. We should expand that. We should also, and this should not take a great deal of political capital if we didn't have so much money destroying politics. We ought to be investing in early childhood education and our K-12 education. And also make public higher education affordable. Making higher education affordable. This is not... You know, we did this. I mean, we had... Somebody in this room must remember the GI Bill. Anybody remember? Anybody remember the GI Bill? And then in the 1950s, we supported an entire generation of young people in terms of... the University of California, Berkeley, where I teach, tuition and fees in 1955 were zero. We had a public higher education system that was expanding and charging nothing on the same principle as our K-12 system. We understood higher education as a public good, not as an individual investment. It was a public good. Where did that go? Why don't we understand that anymore? I mean, the same thing has to do with health care. I mean, the Affordable Care Act, I believe, is a big advance, but why not a single-payer plan? It's obvious. I mean, Medicare for all, even a public option would have been helpful. We can move in that direction. All I want to stress with you is that one reason we're having such a hard time moving in directions that respond and counteract widening inequality in this country is because you have one of the corollaries of widening inequality, which is all of that money coming down and undermining politics and undermining our political system. The other problem with regard to widening inequality is that, and here's an interesting thing, political scientists over the years have studied widening inequality and seen that there is a direct correlation with the degree of inequality and the degree of polarization in politics. In other words, you see very high inequality in the 1890s, 1900, again in the 1920s, and you have very high political polarization, almost gridlock. And then very low inequality in the 1950s, 1960s, and you actually have a lot of nonpartisan activity, and then partisanship starts rising again as inequality starts rising, and now, guess what? We can't get anything done, certainly in Washington, it is just gridlock. What does inequality have to do with political polarization? Nobody knows exactly. That is, political scientists have seen the correlation. They haven't been able to figure out direction of causation, but I think it is pretty clear. I think that because people increasingly feel themselves working harder and harder and getting nowhere, they get frustrated. Naturally, it's human. They get angry. And as they get frustrated and as they get angry, they create the possibility for politicians to prey upon and take advantage of that anger through the politics of resentment, scapegoating. Everybody would like a simple answer. Why am I working harder and harder? The game seems rigged. Who's to blame? And so you have some I'm not saying all politicians by any means, but you have some politicians and even some media outlets. I won't name names. Bill O'Reilly. No, I won't. You know, Bill O'Reilly accuses me of being a communist. I am not, nor have I ever been a member of the Communist Party. But the point is that you get a kind of politics of resentment in America that splits people off from one another. And the media is merely reflecting it. It's taking advantage of it, but it's also reflecting it, as are politicians. I was on a television show not that long ago debating economic policy with the chief economist who had been the chief economist for John McCain in the 2008 election, and we discovered that we agreed on much more than we disagreed. And I thought it was a good modeling experience. You know, the public needs to see Democrats and Republicans agree, and we came to a station break, and the producer said into my earbud, I said, "We're doing pretty well, right?" She said, "No." I said, "Why not? I thought we're doing pretty well." And she said, "No, you've got to be angrier." I said, "I don't want to be angrier. Why should I be angry?" She said, "Because you've got people all over the country surfing through hundreds of channels, and they're going to stop only when they see a fight." Kind of a gladiator mud wrestling philosophy of media. And I said, I don't want to do that. She said, you really do have to. I said, no. She said, "We've got 10 seconds left. You've got to be angrier." And I said, "No." She said, "You must." And at that point, I lost my temper. But this is what we are up against. You know, I travel around the country a great deal, and I talk to a lot of people. In fact, I actually have been trying, although this is an exception, I try to spend more of my time in so-called red states than I do blue states. And I was in Tennessee and North Carolina last week, and what I have found is that most people who describe themselves, and many of you, presumably, who describe yourselves as Republicans, you are very decent, very commonsensical, and I've enjoyed conversing. I mean, we only learn when we talk with people who disagree with us. That's how we learn. And one of the problems is that so many of us are in our bubbles. We are segregating not only by income, but we are also segregating by belief. We want to be surrounded by people who agree with us, and it's just very enjoyable to be in a cocoon, so you don't have to ever have anything you believe challenged, but that's not the way we learn. I drive, whenever I can, my Mini Cooper. I have a little Mini Cooper, and I drive it across the country, from coast to coast. I drove it when I first went out to Berkeley, where I now teach. I drove it from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California, are really the same city. I mean, the climate is slightly different, but they're basically the same. So I was driving from, the same city to the same city, but I tried to create a route and enough time so that I could talk to a lot of people along the way, and I enjoyed myself. This was a number of years ago. I discovered that there were no Mini Coopers in the center of the United States. Did you know that? There were none, absolutely none. And I was in a gas line. I was waiting for gas in I think it was Oklahoma City, and some truckers, big guys, came up to my Mini Cooper. I was sitting in the Mini Cooper, and they tapped on the window, and I lowered the window, and they said, "What is this?" I said, this is a Mini Cooper." "A Mini what?" I said, it's a Mini Cooper. It's designed in England, but its parts are coming from all over the United States and all over the world." And they said, "Well, but how does anybody fit in there?" Now, I had a decision to make. And I opened the door, and I got out, and I stood up, and I said, "No problem." And they looked at me, kind of forlorn. And I said, "Well, you see, I'm from Massachusetts, and we're all under 5 feet tall." But then we had a good discussion. We talked about politics, and we talked about all sorts of things, and I've enjoyed my discussions, but we're not talking to each other nearly enough. In fact, many of us are seduced by a number of mythologies. They are economic mythologies, and they're mythologies that are propounded by people who either don't know the reality, or they know the reality and would rather that we'd not know the reality. One of the mythologies we've talked about already, that is, you can't raise the minimum wage without causing jobs to be lost. I gave you the truth, but that mythology is used all over the country, and it's drummed into people's heads over and over and over again. Here's another mythology, that the rich are the job creators and they need tax cuts in order to create jobs. Now, that used to be called supply-side economics or trickle-down economics. Here's the problem with that idea is that we tried it. You know, there are very few economic ideas that have actually been tried in practice. This one has been unfortunate enough to have been tried in practice. We had some supply-side tax cuts under Ronald Reagan and then again under George W. Bush, and guess what? Nothing trickled down. Nothing positive trickled down. The median wage was flat or dropping, and has been over 30 years in terms of adjusted for inflation. We've tried it. Supply-side economics doesn't work. Besides, the rich are not the job creators. The job creators, as Nick Hanauer keeps reminding us in that wonderful film that Nick starred in called Inequality for All, which David only saw 5 times. And David, what's stopping you from a 6th time? But as Nick keeps on reminding us, and it's absolutely true, the job creators are not the people at the top. The job creators are the people in the middle and below. They are the ones who create the jobs because it's their purchasing and it's their buying that inspire and create incentives for businesses to expand. Without them, you wouldn't. It's the same logic as the minimum wage that we just talked about. Or here's another, the third mythology, that somehow corporations need lower taxes in order to create jobs. Now, anybody who believes this, let me tell you something. American corporations are now sitting on over $2 trillion of cash. They don't know what to do with it. They're buying back their own shares of stock, which is the most unimaginative thing you can possibly think of. Instead of investing in new R&D or expanding, they don't need additional tax cuts. What they ought to do with their money is pay their employees more. I mean, this is something... This is not new. Henry Ford, in 1913, he understood that if you pay employees, he had employees on his Model T Ford line, he paid them twice what the going rate was for factory employees, with the idea that other competitors would have to do the same, and if everybody raised their wages, there would be more purchasers of Model T Fords and other automobiles, and he was exactly right. That's exactly how he made so much money, by lifting wages. Here's another mythology, and a dangerous one. The way we get more jobs is we reduce wages overall. Have you heard this one? I heard this stated articulately, I mean very, very specifically by Michelle Bachmann, a representative like Michelle Bachmann. No, be respectful. Michelle Bachmann she's no longer, she was a congressperson, and she said that the way we reduce unemployment, in fact, we could get rid of unemployment altogether if we got rid of the minimum wage completely. Now, there is a certain diabolical logic to that. That is, if we were willing, all of us, to work for a nickel an hour, or maybe a penny an hour, maybe we would all have jobs. In fact, slavery was a full employment system. Do you see the absurdity? I mean, the goal cannot be just employment. The goal is employment with good jobs. That is the goal. To just say the goal is employment and to assume that everybody's being paid too much and what we want to do is get jobs and wages down puts logic completely on its head. And the fifth related mythology is that people are paid what they are worth. Now, you've heard this. To some extent, this has got to be correct because they're paid what they're worth in the market. It's got kind of a tautology. If they're paid what they're worth in the market, that means the market must be paying them what they're worth. But that is not a terribly sophisticated logic. In fact, that is a trivial and dumb logic. Buried in that statement that people are paid what they're worth is a moral claim that is hidden, but it is heard by people all over this country. If you are not paid very much, you're not worth very much. If you're paid huge amounts, you must be worth a huge amount in terms of society. Now, let me tell you something. I think some of the most valuable people in terms of society who I have ever met are teachers and social workers. And I could add in nurses and childcare workers. And I could add in home health care providers. And I could add in a lot of people who are providing all kinds of care and attention and love to a lot of people. They get paid very, very little. Are they worth little? They are worth a fortune. On the other hand, look at a hedge fund manager. Now, I don't want to insult anybody, and if you happen to be a hedge fund manager, I like you. I don't in any way disparage you, but I want to raise some questions about your social worth. Because if you are simply moving money or hedging against hedges, and a lot of hedge fund managers, they're hedging against hedges who are hedging against hedges. They're involved in fact, I'm not going to limit my comment to hedge fund managers. I'm also going to go to private equity managers and even venture into investment banking and some other of the high levels of finance that got us into trouble in 2008 with their derivatives and derivatives on derivatives. I ran into, right after the crash of 2008, I ran into a fellow who I worked with in the Clinton administration, Bob Rubin, who was Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Treasury. I was Secretary of Labor. People come up to me and say it sometimes and say, "Aren't you Bob Rubin?" And I say, "No. No." And I asked Bob Rubin that right after the crash of 2008, I saw him in a conference and I said, "Bob, what happened? I mean, you were executive chair of the executive committee at Citigroup. So you probably know what happened. Just explain it to me." And he said it was a perfect storm. A perfect storm. And I said, "What does that mean, a perfect storm?" And he said, well, just everything worked out the worst possible way you could imagine in ways that nobody could have foreseen. Well, maybe that's right, but in terms of everything that I read, everything that I understood, everybody who I interviewed, everything that I tried to get into my head about what happened, it wasn't a perfect storm. It was a concocted storm. In other words, the biggest banks, they took risks with your money and my money. And unfortunately, the only thing that actually, I was very proud to be part of the Bill Clinton administration, but in 1999, Bill Clinton did something that I don't think he should have done. He got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. And that was important to have, because that separated investment banking from commercial banking. And when you had investment banking and commercial banking together, you had the possibility that bankers would take a lot of risks with other people's money, and some of that money was insured money, sort of a rerun of the savings and loan disaster. And on top of that, you didn't really have any controls on the insurers who were supposed to be insuring the money and the risks that the banks were taking. AIG, for example. I don't want to dredge all this up. This is pretty awful old history, but I want to just dredge it up for the purpose of reminding you that these people, many of them, made tens, 20s, 30s of millions of dollars a year. In fact, 3 years ago, in the middle of a very, very anemic recovery, the 15 highest paid hedge fund managers got paid $1 billion each. Now, again, I'm not a class warrior, but I want to raise this issue, just this question with you. Because if we have people like home health care workers and teachers and nurses and social workers, and people who are custodians of some of the most important and valuable things in our society, such as our children and our elderly people and others who desperately need help, and they're getting paid almost nothing. And you have people who are gambling in ways that potentially ruin the economy. And in that case, in 2008, many of those people did not pay any price. Nobody was jailed. They're too big to jail, too big to fail, too big to curtail. And they're getting paid $1 billion. Well, it seems to me that all of that is evidence enough that the proposition that you're paid what you're worth can't possibly be true. I come across people, in fact, when I was in Knoxville, Tennessee last week, I came across a young woman who told me that she was not doing very well economically. And we had a little conversation. We didn't have much time, but I said, well, tell me what's going on. And she started to tear up. She started to cry. She said that she was holding down 3 jobs. And she was trying to get enough money together to eat and to have a place to live. And she was not making it, and her health was deteriorating. And she was going to be out on the street. And she started to cry. And she said, "I'm so ashamed." And what I said back to her is what I desperately hope everybody understands. If you're holding down 3 jobs, it's not your fault. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You are doing everything you possibly can. You're not losing ground because you are blameworthy. There is something called an economic system. It's organized in a certain way. Right now, it's not organized in a way that rewards most people for the work they do. People don't have, as they did 40 or 50 years ago, most people don't have, for example, a union behind them. They need a union behind them. Because a union gave and still gives, but a union provides bargaining power. In union, there really is strength. In the 1950s, 35% of American workers were unionized. And that meant that so many workers were unionized that even the non-union workers and their employers got the benefits of those prevailing wage and benefit agreements. But now, in the private sector in the United States, fewer than 7% of our workers are unionized, which means that workers don't really have the bargaining power they need. It is not their fault. It is not the fault of this young lady who is in tears, feeling like a failure, feeling ashamed. You see, one of the problems with the "you're paid what you're worth" moralizing is that it makes people who are not doing well feel like not only a failure, but feel shame. They feel ashamed of where they are. And they don't reach out to other people for help, and they don't reach out to other people to organize them, to organize. And what they need to do is feel enough confidence and enough power that they join with others, and joining with others gives them even more confidence, gives them even more power, because in union and in political organization, there is strength. And so what we need to do, and you have already done this in Seattle, and you're going to do more of it, and there's a lot more to do in terms of paid family and medical leave, for example, paid sick leave, many of the other things we've talked about tonight. What you can do and what we can do, and all of us are getting inspired from what you achieved. We have got to counteract and create the countervailing power that is needed in our politics and in our economy to give average people, once again, the kind of say over their lives, the kind of political voice, the kind of economic power that Americans once had. This is not a zero-sum game, by the way. The rich in this country would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy than they're doing now with a huge share of an economy that's barely growing at all. But they bought a lot of lies, and they are, some of them, financing a lot of mythologies and a lot of lies. The first step toward the kind of organization and countervailing power that I'm talking about is to know the truth, to spread the truth, to know what it is that makes this economy function, to know that the center of the economy are working people who are getting paid adequate wages, to know that upward mobility and equal opportunity are the guiding principles not only of the economy, but also of our entire democracy. If we don't remember that, if we don't cherish that, we have very little to hold on to. So Seattle, let me thank you for what you've accomplished. Let me thank you for setting the light and a beacon light for the rest of this country. And let me thank you for what you will accomplish also in the future. Thank you.